So this last video in the playlist, we've discussed how throughout the 20th century changes to family structure have underpinned some major institutional transformation, and we're at a point in crisis where that understanding now needs to reach elite level because we have to accommodate these new ways of thinking to accommodate the way the world now is. And I wanted to end this playlist with quite a longish video about the symbolism of the lone parent, and why it's effective, and what it is, and the way it's constructed, and why it's just been at the root of this crisis, and why it's at the root of the turf issue. So I spent a long time trying to come to terms, like me and Thatcher, I have visceral feelings about Margaret Thatcher. But I spent quite a long time reading through her memoirs to try and understand how she had had such a fucking horrible reaction that had played out so terribly in my mother's life. And while I wanted it to be mean old Thatcher and mean old Tories, that was not, in fact, what I found. So we've talked about how that change that my mother's generation, these little bloody working class teenage girls with prams, they were the sign of a major change that had never ever been expected, anticipated, designed. It just happened. The end of women being legally subordinated by men. Women said no over the course of 100 years. And, you know, like 100 years after that change was evident, my mother's generation were these powerless working class girls with their children, embodying this major change. And the demonization that Thatcher rained down on them, that's been at the absolute core, the structural core of our political economy since, is quite complex, because actually Thatcher may have used it, but that was by public consent. And in actual fact, society had difficulty with these girls and couldn't understand how this changed. And didn't, you know, hasn't sat reading bloody sociologists from 1900 to see how they thought about it, hasn't gone through the Royal Divorce Commission, you know, from 1858, but actually just was responding to this. And, you know, this was shocking to people. This was a major change. This was what happens to the structure of our society if this is occurring. And these girls with their children, they bore the weight of this. They actually bore the weight of this. But this was genuine. It was naturally occurring. We actually still haven't, in 2018, even begun to accommodate the shifts that those young women represented. And Milton Friedman, hard-boiled and Keynesian bastard that he was, he basically published a pamphlet, and he's a misogynist old twat too, and he basically put to, you know, Reagan and Thatcher that, you know, he gave them single parents as a tool that they could use, as a mirror they could use to deflect failure and blame failure on. And it stuck because they believed it. And they believed it because society believed it, and they believed it. And in the time since, the media and policy-making culture that emerged from this period, the think tanks, the newspapers, the elite academic institutions, they kind of sealed themselves off gradually at this point, and they still believe it. And they've been able to reliably use this symbolism for about 30 years because A, we've been excluded from their world, we're not likely to turn up and say you can't do that. B, it's kind of worked, the public have supported it. And C, it's been a rather handy symbolism to avoid looking at all these shifts that single parents embody. So the emergence of the care economy, the development of equality frameworks, the development of systems that protect from violence and abuse, the recognition of the way that male violence is at the centre of institutional development. These major changes, since 2005, it's been completely legally not viable to use social policy to encourage women to not end the family unit because they've been legally obliged to leave abuse. But as these systems, this is intersectionality, this is these systems, they have developed away from these elite institutions, they still assume that the symbolism of the lone parent is quite reliable. And because our label's reliable, and because we keep producing excellent children, and we produce the most educated working class on record, and then I've produced another generation who's fucking awesome, and I'm fairly well together, they think they can still do it. And so in 2010, that's when I met the left, and The Guardian, and Labour, and the Labour movement. They didn't know about the systems that I was discussing, and they agreed that the reflex response to crisis should be hitting out at women like me. And they would triangulate on it by constructing a false anti-cots movement And what they've demonstrated in the meantime is some really disturbing stuff, but they're kind of locked to die in a bubble on Twitter, and we still have to accommodate these shifts. So the symbolism of the lone parent offers a very interesting point, because it's the actual point in our political economy where we have refused, we've kept these systems out of our eye line. Now, I went to the LSE and I looked at how we've been measuring inequality, and I looked at welfare economics, and welfare economics does not currently even recognise duties to children, does not recognise equality legislation, does not recognise changes to family structure. There is no understanding at the LSE about why it is, or what it is that shapes these systems, and that's because it happens out of their outline, and they've been historically there to manage the political consequences of those changes. Well, this has now changed, and they have to develop an understanding of how these systems work, and they're developing a multidimensional understanding of inequality. But the symbolism of the lone parent has all of a sudden lost political utility, because suddenly we need to know that family shape change, we need to discuss demographic changes, we need to discuss the emergence of these new aspects of the economy, we need to incorporate these into our thinking. And so all of that, and we obviously can't legally ask a single parent to end a family unit when we're also legally obliging them to. And this is the half space that we've been sat in the last 8 years. But for quite a while it seemed like that was the sensible response to a financial crisis, and that's where I've been caught in. And so what I've tried to do during that period, because I've been aware of those shifts, is because I knew that we would reach a point where it become apparent where that was not a sensible thing to do. In the period where our elite institutions thought I could be disenfranchised by a cash transfer system, I made sure that I wrote for the left and right of the press. I made sure that I spoke at Oxford University and at several other Russell Group universities. I made sure that I was shortlisted for the Orwell Prize. I made sure that I got a master's from the LSE. So at this point in time, where this class of people thought that we were reverting to a pre-welfare state norm where the poor would audition to them for pity, I made sure that I demonstrated that that was not happening. And that's partly why what's had to happen on Twitter is they've had to be so abusive to me, because the reason the left experienced meeting me as an injury to their identity was not anything I did, their imaginary stuff about being bullying. It's because my identity means that their identity is no longer valid. And I mean that there is no mediating class where the poor audition for pity. And actually what they've just demonstrated, because they're still hanging on to this, and what they've done is they've recycled the symbolism of the lone parent, and they just, they use ever more different words. TERF is the new one. If you discuss these systems, we will terrorize you. And what they're demonstrating is that, you can see with the symbolism of the lone parent, the institutions that are still using it are very, very vulnerable now, because it's about to blow, as it has no political utility anymore. And as we move past this crisis and develop a more multi-dimensional understanding of inequality, more intersectional understanding of how power dynamics shape systems, it's going to be a very useful thing to look at. And I just